Hello and welcome to PCI Webinars. Today's webinar, did you see that post about adapting to change in children's services with Jill Burket, Ragase, and Amy Schardein. Jill has enthusiastically shared her passion for youth services and collection management through workshops and webinars for more than 5 years. She earned her MLS from the University of Kentucky and has worked as both a youth services and collection development librarian. She's also the proud parent of 2 sets of boy-girl twins and lives with them and her husband Mark in Cincinnati, Ohio. You can find Jill online at jumbleofjill.com. Amy is a children's librarian in Covington, Kentucky for the Kenton County Public Library, where she has specialized in early childhood work for over 15 years. She plans and presents programs, manages book collections, writes and manages grants, and presents on a variety of library topics related to children's services. Amy also lives in the Cincinnati area. She plays her ukulele and manages the schedule of 2 teenage children, including a sweet 16 girl, in her spare time. Coming to you now from Cincinnati, it's Jill and Amy.
Hey, everybody.
Hello, everyone.
Amy and I have been jokingly referring to this as the webinar that gets us fired.
I think I've been going with the webinar that I hope doesn't get me fired. So
let me ask you for your
turns being the optimistic person.
Are either of your bosses online?
Not at this webinar. So, woo!
We're excited that you guys are here today, and we are going to do our best to thoughtfully and cheerfully navigate through some thorny issues with grace and humor.
Yes. And your comments are much welcomed. So please, there's a lot of times where we'll ask you for your input, and it's helpful to us when you do give that input. So, and it widens the discussion. I always find when there's comments that generally we get really good insights, and then we end up learning something too. So we would very much appreciate your participation today.
Absolutely. So briefly, before we dive in, I kind of wanted to talk about how Amy and I have formatted today's webinar. We are going to start by talking about how to think about change and ideas on how to manage change, and quite honestly, the failure that sometimes comes with trying new things. We're going to walk through a few examples of recent controversies and how we responded to them and the things that we thought about. And then finally, we are going to talk about some resources that are helpful in broadening our perspective and stepping outside of our comfort zone, and how to handle feedback and pushback from library administration or your board or coworkers or the public. So we're going to kind of try to tackle a large thing from many angles and give you kind of the framework that we use to think about these things more than specific answers to specific situations, if that makes sense. Let's jump in.
All right. So I think if you are a children's librarian right now in particular, and you are engaged in social media, you see a lot of discussions that you don't expect to become heated. Like, is anybody here on Storytime Underground and have watched that happen? I feel bad for the person who just posted something like, "Oh, look at this! I'm working on my gingerbread party," and then all of a sudden it becomes a huge argument, and it is really tough. So all of these things, they go down, and I always feel bad for the person who posts, and then makes me hesitate to post. I don't know if any of you have that same feeling where you feel like, oh my gosh, you don't want to be the person who accidentally sets something off in whatever format you are in. So I've been a children's librarian for my current location 17 years, and then I worked in other libraries for about 4 years before that. So going on just around 21 years of working in libraries, and there's been a lot of change just in that time. And I know Jill has been at the game just about as long, right, Jill?
Yeah, Amy and I actually met in grad school, so we have had about the same number of years of professional experience. My career has taken a slightly different turn. I work in a hybrid space. I work for a literacy nonprofit that both operates a retail children's bookstore and also develops, we kind of work as a think tank and help Title I schools develop and execute literacy projects in order to close the literacy gap for kids ages 4 to 8. So I live in a weird space that straddles two really different worlds, where we have people coming into a boutique type shop who pay retail or retail plus a program fee to have a literacy experience, while simultaneously passing out free books and trying to hustle and get people to come in for free and provide services and materials for Title I kids.
It's a really neat job Jill has. So just so cool. But so I think the reality is we're working in children's librarianship and in bookstores and in publishing, and those are fields that are really dominated. And later on, we'll show you some statistics that back this statement up, that are really dominated by white people, and then in children's librarianship in particular, white women. And that we bring a point of view to our work. Jill and I are both white women, and I know that's who I am. I can't help bringing that to work with me. And it makes for a certain scope being dominant in our work. And I think a great change that I've been seeing over time is pushback against that. And it can be hard to change. It's really tough to change some of my habits, but it's really necessary and it's really important. And in the end, it's always rewarding. So some of the changes that I will struggle, I'll recognize, this is something I have to address. I have to figure something new out, and I will have a little interior come apart about it. And then I always am happy with what I've done in the end, eventually, when I get to the right spot. But it is tricky because we see all these issues happening and sort of real time in front of us on social media. So what we are hoping today is that we could talk about some of them, and maybe it would be a less daunting place to work out some of that. And then hopefully you can learn from some of our mistakes and how we have learned from those mistakes. All right.
I clicked the slide. I decided I'm being the slide clicker.
That's good. It's good when there's one slide kicker, because otherwise we get ourselves in trouble and we end up ahead of the place. So it's okay to try new things. I think that it's interesting. I don't know if you could list how long you've been working in children's librarianship in the discussion bar. That would be interesting for me to see. I feel like when you start out in children's librarian, it's all new things, right? So you have a certain fearlessness about you because you don't know. Like, I remember I really super love to do process art, and I super love to do cooking, and going to a library system where I didn't end up staying very long. And this was one of the factors where that was not how things were done there. And there was a tremendous amount of people not wanting to do these things because they would be messy. And, but I come from an education background before I was a librarian. And look, just like Lisa, first grade teacher for 25 years. I was a first grade teacher for like 2 years, Lisa, so K and 1. And so that education background makes me I'm always looking at what is the goal? What do I want the children to learn? And sort of that to me is the priority. And it's definitely not, let's keep the room tidy. So I was having a big thing about, I wanted to try this, which was for them new things. But for me, everything was new because I was a new children's librarian. So literally everything I did was going to be a new thing. And the longer I do it, though, I've had time to develop some habits. So, Evelyn wins, 28 years, Evelyn. Good stuff. So we've got a nice variety, but everyone's been in the game for a little bit, it looks like. So what I found the longer I'm doing children's librarianship is that I sort of have to be more intentional about trying new things and new ideas out so that I don't fall into habits. And I made myself a little experimental sandbox inside my regular programming, which I really love. I have two ways that I do that. One is at story time, I don't really craft anymore. We craft occasionally, but I pretty much offer a rotation of activities, and there's more than one activity. And by having more than one thing at the tables, I can insert something in there, and if it doesn't work out, it's okay because there's something else in the room that I'm more certain of, that I know it's a hit. So it's a way that I rotate through little new activities or materials that I'm not sure of, and I don't have to commit to buying enough for 30 kids because each table seats like 5 to 6 kids at a time. So I just can commit to this little try of something. So that's one way that I've done it. And the other, my favorite program that I do now, which was a big experiment when it started and I was super nervous about, was Library Playgroup, which we host once a month. And I started it because the moms groups of my community got into a fight about who was allowed to come to MOPS and who was allowed to come to moms, and people were being very exclusionary by address, and it was all a big dust up I was watching happen on social media on a local parenting page of which I'm an admin. So that was really fun. So be very careful what you accept being an admin of. Hot tip. That was really, so I started this play group once a month, and I just get out a whole lot of library toys, and we have snacks, and then what the parents have told me was important, really good coffee. So we have very good coffee. The bulk of the budget for this program is spent on very nice coffee. But within the playgroup, because it's very open-ended, I have found that I can try all sorts of things. Like, am I not sure how a book should work in terms of audience participation? Do I need to work on a new ukulele song? It's also a casual conversation area, so I can be talking to parents about what are the programs they would like to look for at the library, what time would be good for them, would they like to help? I've accidentally made myself a little experimenting ground inside the library playgroup. So it's really nice to give yourself a space to try new things. So if you don't have that sort of space existing within your programs, try to find one. See if you can shoehorn one into an existing program, or maybe add one thing to your schedule. Just a place that is within your programming to intentionally be able to do new things. And then once you've made that space, it opens you up to keeping to try new things, even if it's easier to do the things you've already done. But so I have this place where it's okay to try new things, and I can fail at them because they're smaller failures. But also sometimes I try big things and then they're big failures. So you can, if you want to use emoticons, raise your hand if you have planned and hosted a program that was a failure. I don't know. Are we able to use the emoticons? Let me see if I can do it.
We can put it down in the discussion box too.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing. Like, I don't necessarily have a lab like Amy where I can try things out. Our mission is to grow seed projects. Everything is new. But what it has done for me is it's been such an amazing lesson that it's okay to fail, and that successes can come out of failures. And right before this webinar started, I was telling Amy this story, and she encouraged me to share it with you, so I'm going to. But as an example, it is my job to provide literacy experiences for kids in Title I schools. And so I see on a weekly basis what's going on in their schools. I'm familiar with what their lives look like in that way that you can be when you're adjacent to something. And I thought I was well grounded in it. And then we had an opportunity. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was coming to Cincinnati with one of the other bookstores in town. And we were able to reach out to her staff in advance and make arrangements for her to meet with a small group. They limited me to 30 kids, and that we could do a dual language program where she would meet with the kids for 30 minutes and talk to them about, they were kids who came from refugee experiences to the United States. And she could talk with them about her story and overcoming challenges associated with growing up poor or growing up with interrupted education. And then each kid was going to get a copy of a book and she was going to sign it. It sounded amazing and great. And I was like, look at what I'm planning. And I was so excited. I ran and worked out all the details with the other bookstore and the publisher and the staff at the justice's office. And I went to the planning meeting for my partner schools. And I was like, look at what I did. And they were like, cool. So that's offsite. And these families don't have cars. I was like, oh. And our families are on free and reduced lunch, and our school policy is that if we're doing school events during the dinner hour, we have to feed everyone. And then if we feed everyone, you have to take all the dietary restrictions, and we have to be allergen compliant, and you have to invite the parents, and so on and so forth. And I was like, oh, I felt terrible. Obviously, there were those issues that we needed to work out. Duh. I mean, it was just one of those things where when you create a new program, you often don't know what the hurdles are going to be. And then sometimes they smack you in the face and you're like, why in the world did I not think of that? Or how would I have ever thought of that? I mean, it can be on both ends of the spectrum.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. And you don't know what you don't know. And that I think where we have to get to a point where we go, you know what, that's true. And it's okay.
Right. And thank the person who pointed all those things out to you.
Yes. Yes, because I was living over in my la-la land where we have busing. I mean, it's,
right.
And
this person from the school is metaphorically pointing out the lipstick on your teeth, which is what a good friend does for you. They don't let you just run around with that going on. They tell you, right? Hey, you need to fix this situation that you accidentally made, or maybe, not intentionally, but a little thoughtlessly. We've all been there. So I think what happens next is, we think about what to do with our failures when we have them. So I think that's the next slide, right? What to do with our failures?
It is what to do with our failures.
Right. So I think my number one tip, and I do this after successes too, but after every program, I take notes. So I have Excel sheets that I keep for weekly programs where I take notes, and there's sort of the numerical notes, right? So I how many kids were there and how many adults were there. I also write down their names because that really helps me to remember the names. And sometimes I'll make a little note to help me remember, an interest or something I said I would get for a patron by the next story time or whatever. I will note all the family names that I know and little conversation details, because my library is an urban library, and traditionally it can be more difficult to build strong program attendance. And so I found one of the ways I do that is through connecting with them very personally and remembering details about them. And my notes help me do that. But I also make notes about room setup stuff. I once had an epic failure because we got some really cool new chairs, and there were adult-sized chairs, but they'd given some to us to use for, like, they thought they would be nice in the programming room. And I was like, that's so great, the adults can have these chairs. And I had always been sitting in like a little children's chair to do story time, because pretty much all I do is story time for babies through 5. I do some other special stuff, but the bulk of my week is story time. And I was like, well, I can sit in this chair and it'll be more comfortable. And then we have these other chairs. And what really happened was like an enormous turf war over who got to sit in these chairs between the adults. And it was just a colossal failure. And so now we know in these programs, we cannot bring out these chairs. These chairs have to be hidden away because they just create all sorts of problems. I'll make a note of book displays, how many books got checked out, what kind of stuff to display, things I might need to order more of. And they also become very helpful for other people, all these notes, because if I can't be there for whatever, there's extensive notes on how the room setup should look and what works best and all these things. So I have sort of long-term notes and I have short-term notes. I make notes about, like, you got a new mom and they're a chatty Cathy and all of your little tricks for get them to not talking story time didn't work. So now I need to start reiterating story time behavior expectations at the beginning of story time and all of that good stuff. And so those are like the sort of things I might do with a successful program. But then also I talk about things when they do go terribly wrong, like we had Michelle mention that starting a new program and no one comes, right? So you start trying to think what was going on. I also include the weather in my notes because the weather makes a huge difference, particularly if you have people walking to your library. But because maybe it was the weather that week. Maybe I need to get the word out to a different thing. Maybe, because this happened, the schools decided to have all-day kindergarten and, we didn't adjust our programming schedule accordingly. Or like sometimes structural things have happened in your family's lives that you don't know about. We don't know everything that's happening in the community. So like Jill's example of the Sonia Sotomayor story was, she almost had a really colossal failure that she was able to save, but she learned a lot. So I think you have some new practices probably moving forward, I'm guessing, around these programs.
I don't run off on my own and create things without checking in with people as much. I don't want to say I don't do that because that's not true. I don't do it as much. Things that I learned is I now have a schedule for the rates that the bus company charges Cincinnati Public Schools and by distance and how much time. And I got the printout of what kind of space you have to have. Did you know that they will not park a bus? There's all kinds of rules about where you can park a school bus. I have the policy on where the school buses can park. I have a copy of the dietary guidelines for the school district. I have a list of people who maybe couldn't provide food for that thing because it was like in 3 days, but where it said, please call me back the next time you have something with more notes. I have a list of donors that I had to reach out to pay for the bus who said yes or no, or maybe, or can you come back to me with other things? So if I want to pull off something like this specifically again, I have a lot of resources to go back to. And I do. I'm working with this same bookstore here in town to pitch another co-program again for the fall. And I have all of my notes. So this is going to be better. And I gave my resource officers group a heads up. And I said, here's this thing we're pitching. I don't even know if I'm going to get it. But this time I'm talking to you in advance. We now know what this looks like. And I feel like the biggest thing I took from it was, instead of just saying this isn't going to work out, because it doesn't have to be that you have a Supreme Court justice. This was a situation where I was highly motivated to solve it. Who doesn't want to make this happen? But what I really took from it was I could approach everything with this attitude and more things would work out.
Right. So including the partners in the planning, which is huge, and then thinking out a lot of the details. And then just really looking more closely at our communities and what's happening there. And, and also I think, so another thing I do with my notes is it helps me, because I don't know what the reporting requirements are at your libraries, but I have to report out every month about what I did. And so when something's a failure and I have to put like a 0 down for attendance or a much lower number than we wanted on an expensive program, if I can talk about the changes I'll make moving forward as a result of what I've learned, it really helps that report out a lot. Like with my managers, it makes a big difference.
May I interrupt with a question?
Yes.
Do those notes belong to you or to the library?
I would say both. So I have private notes that I keep that are like, as private as anything that I do on my work computer is, which is not ever completely private because, you signed that agreement, guys. But I also we have like the shared files that we use, and I keep some notes in the shared files. And those are the notes that are going to help people who are covering for my program. So, and my private notes are things that like, you said you'd get this book for this patron, or you remember to do, like little reminders for me, and that I read the next week before I do that program again. But I keep both kinds of notes, I guess is the answer. So, and Evelyn suggested immediate feedback from parents is useful. Yes, I do get that. So always by not having a craft and I just have activities, there's a little more parent chat time in there, and I will hear that. Like I love to do sort of adaptations to pop songs, like why babies nap till they got to take naps. That has been a big hit in baby story time, or all the single babies, those sorts of things. And the parents will tell me right away, like sometimes they're like, oh, let's do this song. And we write some sort of baby friendly parody that involves scarves. So, but yeah, the feedback from the parents about how things went or what they would do differently is super helpful right there in the moment. Oh my gosh, it's already 2:30. We gotta pick it up.
So we thought we would talk about a couple specific examples that have come up lately on the message boards, and how Amy and I worked through approaching them in our professional lives. We thought we'd start with diversity and own voices, and including diverse books in your programs, displays, and marketing. Not just on the holidays.
Or just during February, since we're in February. But that's another pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, don't do that.
It's a big topic.
It is. So here's what we know. Amy led with that statistic at the beginning of our hour that children's librarianship in particular is so white lady dominated. And that's not the only challenge that we're facing. While things are improving, we know that we have a really long way to go. You've probably seen this graphic. It's from the University of Wisconsin School of Education. They are funding really great research that looks at the percentage of books published for kids each year that are own voices and depict something other than the white experience in the U.S.
Oh, this isn't even own voices, Jill, though. This is just depictions within the book. I suspect if we went own voices, it would be even more depressing. Also, I went back in time and looked for this, and I can't remember what year it was they started, maybe 2001, 2000, somewhere right around there. It was at 90% white. So we have made some improvements, but we have a way to go.
Yeah.
So, I really feel this one because I do work in a very diverse community. And so I've always made an effort to include books that include everybody. Unless, like today at Baby Storytime, all the books were just about colors. So there were 0 people in them, which is one way to go. But it is frankly less welcoming to your patrons than making sure they see themselves in your book. And I do have people who come to my story time from out of my service area, but specifically because they have seen me in some capacity, sometimes at an outreach, sometimes I've done story time at museums and things before, but they will drive a very long way to come to the story time because they feel welcomed just by the books that I've chosen. And I've had more than one family tell me that this is, I had one woman who for years drove 30 minutes each way to come to a 30-minute long baby story time because she went to one in a museum and there were Black babies in the books. And that was the first story time she had gone to that her babies had babies that looked like them in the books to see. And I found that heartbreaking for her. And I was glad that I had made her feel welcome, that I wasn't even working really hard on that particular story time. I think it was Margaret Miller books. And I know this is true with several Chinese speaking families that I have coming to my story time. And I currently have some other immigrant families who have given me that very specific feedback. So when I look at the books, you don't just look at the cover, you have to open up the book and look in the inside. So like look in the background. I was talking to Jill recently about my list of books with hijabs in them, there are the books that are, we have a few really good ones that have been published recently that are sort of about the hijab, but I also have a list of books I keep where there's just someone in a hijab in the background, because I have lots of kids in hijabs that I see in schools and in my library, and I want them to be able to see themselves in their books. So that actually, like, who do we see in a book? And then you also need to look at what role do they play in the book too. You don't want to have it where it's only all of your non-white characters are just in the background of the book, but the background is important. So you have to look at the whole book. So that's what I do, is I get all my books together for a story time and I lay them out and I look at them and I see what I've done. And if I have, because it is easy to put together a whole story time without intention, just because you picked books and maybe you picked out the stories that you thought were the funniest or the best, and then it's an all-white story time. It happens to me a lot. And that extra step that I take where I look through all of my books and I go, oh, whoops, and then I have to get to work and see what else I can find. Or sometimes change topics because the books don't exist. And that is very frustrating.
Yeah, so I think the place we see this most when we talk about controversies and trying to have conversations online is when we, as a professional field, try to talk about classics.
Yes.
So classics are hard.
They are.
Let us know down in the discussion. Do you have schools that are using classics? Do you have parents that come in and just want classics? That's the biggest challenge I see. I have parents who come in who they want to read a book with their kids that they read as a child. They want to read a Newbery. This book won the Newbery Award. Well, yes, it did, but that was in 1974 or whatever the year was, and it's maybe not the greatest choice because we've spent time listening to a wider variety of voices, and we're now aware of what's problematic in things that came before. And it can be a really touchy topic because we remember reading these books growing up, and we have all warm feelings associated with it. And it can feel like someone is saying your experience isn't valid or your experience is wrong. And I think what's really being said is, I think you should look at your experience from multiple perspectives and see how this book looks through a different set of eyes. And Amy came up with this great example of the 5 Chinese brothers.
Yes. So I thought of this book because this is a book. Oh, Jill, will you pop that slide? This book, I remember reading it.
Do you not see the 5 Chinese brothers?
I don't. Every now and then it doesn't come up currently. It'll sync up in a second, I'm sure.
All right. Let us know in the discussion if you're seeing the 5 Chinese brothers.
Okay, as I'm not, but I've had this problem last time. But at any rate, so the 5 Chinese brothers, this cover, oh my gosh, just from the cover alone, it's so many stereotypes. But I remember this story and just really, enjoying it as a child. And I still have parents come in and ask for it. I found several current lists of recommended books that it's still on. And just when I look at it now, I find it heartbreaking. I have so many families coming to my library. I would be embarrassed if they saw this book and wanted to check it out. And I think the other thing is that there's a lot of good alternatives to that. if you can think of an alternative, go ahead and list it. I'll tell you how I've tackled this problem. So I actually had someone ask me, oh, could we do this story? And I was like, whoa, I know I'm really not comfortable with this story, but it is based in Chinese folklore. There are variations of this story out there. This is a retelling by white authors and a re-illustration by white authors. And it was not well done at the time. There have been better editions done since that time. So there's the Seven Chinese Brothers, which is similar story, better illustrations. But then I think the better alternative is to look at the own voices. What are the stories being told from the very rich tradition of Chinese folklore by authors who have some authority in the matter? So Ed Young is a great example, Grace Lin. There are so many published options to choose from that will give you a better option than this one that we think of as a classic. And sometimes books just haven't had time to classic. Oh yeah, Lisa, it was the very first book I read as a child, and that was 40 plus years ago, right? So we have these long memories of the book, and there's this nostalgia built in. But it's like when I've been rewatching Friends with my 16-year-old daughter, and yes, oh my gosh, and you didn't realize in the 90s, I just didn't see it because I just didn't see it. Oh, so much racism and homophobia, and then how uncomfortable it makes me. And this is a similar experience where I have to learn to value the emotional connection I had to that as a child, but then also do better going forward and realize that if I give children different experiences with, frankly, better books, honestly, than this one, then they'll have those good feelings about a different book, about a better book moving forward. And it is really hard. And I think there are lots of examples we can find within the classics like this. And it gets dicey doing it, but I always feel like the way to do is to honor the past, but move forward, find the better stuff. Let's go on. So
yeah, I would say we get, it's not our example, and I'm somewhat reluctant to even say this out loud because it's such a hot button issue. We get, I probably get 4 or 5 parents a week who want to come in and they want the Little House books. And I get it. I grew up on those. I watched the TV show. You know, we associate warm feelings with things when we can't see them in the way others see them. And so the way I have been tackling this so that we can somewhat address both sides of it is I say, yeah, we have the Little House books. Let me grab those for you. I don't know if you're aware, but it contains some language. And, you know, we talk about the language in the book. And I said, let me just grab you 2 other Own Voices books that, you know, if you take this one, maybe also take this for a different perspective. Or if you just decide this newer one is a better fit, let's go with that. But I always lead with, I know why you're asking for this, because you had a great experience with it and you want to build a great experience for the child who's with you today. And I want to acknowledge and honor that. I'm not going to judge that. But here are things you may not be aware of, and here are things we've learned. And so here's a broader perspective.
Oh, my goodness. All right. And the other thing we have to remember, doesn't end with classics, Jill.
Doesn't end with classics. When Amy and I started talking about how we handle people who come in and ask for classics, I said, oh, here's my big learning from 2019, and I thank Dr. Debbie Reese for it, is it doesn't end with classics. Here's Pete the cat wearing a feather headdress. So Amy mentioned earlier that we look in the background for the book illustrations and we look in the foreground and we're looking for positives. But of course, you also have to look for negatives. And sometimes racism is obvious and sometimes it's a cat wearing a headdress. And what I really learned from listening to Indigenous people talk about Thanksgiving this year online, I did a lot of listening. And I learned a couple things, 2 of which are on the slide. and we talked about it before, you want to listen without being defensive. Their experience is completely different than mine. And I'm not there to justify my behavior. I'm just there to listen. And what I've done before, we just have to sit in that. And I have to hear how this impacts them. And it's not my job. In the same way that they're not going to say everything you do is great, it's not my job to make them sit there and listen to why I have read Pete the Cat's Thanksgiving book at story time. And Amy mentioned earlier seeing pushback or criticism as a kindness. And, it's like telling someone they have lipstick on their teeth. I'm really glad that I could participate in Twitter discussions where Dr. Reese talked about, let's talk about Thanksgiving books and why they are harmful to Indigenous people. And let's look at what you're portraying and think about it from that perspective. And I was like, oh gosh, I'd always just been like, oh, look, Pilgrims and Indians sitting down and one of them's Pete the Cat. And I did not think about what it looked like from someone else's perspective. And now I'm horrified. But it was a really good learning experience to point out things I hadn't noticed before, to acknowledge my implicit bias, to better understand the issues that were being raised, and to educate myself. We're all information professionals. I don't need someone to sit down with me and tell me all the things that are wrong. I can take the information gleaned from the conversation and educate myself and do some reading and figure out what better choices are. And I think that's the thing, is it's our job to listen and not to defend decades, millennia of whiteness. It's my job to listen. And I think it's important to reframe our thinking to this type of objection and realize that it's a kindness. You wouldn't you probably wouldn't be purposely unkind to someone once you knew that your behavior hurt them. And so I kind of view this as accepting the kindness that they've pointed it out to me, regardless of whether or not in the moment I fully understand or whether I agree. It's just flipped my mindset about it, I guess.
Yes. It's helpful, I found, to even say thank you in the moment. Thank you for telling me, because it starts me on the way I need to best figure out what I'm going to do next and how I will do better, because we want to serve our entire community. No one goes into librarianship because they only want to serve part of the community and they don't want people to feel welcome in libraries. I've never met one librarian ever who was like, those are my goals. Everybody, we all are like, yay, libraries, everybody comes, all are welcome. And if you're accidentally making people feel not welcome, it's good to know. So
yes, I will say, if you are in particular interested about this topic and depictions of popular characters in Thanksgiving books, Dr. Debbie Reese has a blog called American Indians in Children Literature. It's included on our resource list, and we'll talk about it more lately. But complete credit to her for both of those illustrations.
She really is incredible. I get to meet her, and oh my gosh, she's amazing. So, what can we do instead? We got some ideas.
We've got some other ideas. I think I'm leading off here, aren't I? Yes. Oops, how did we go back? There we go. In my workplace, I am lucky enough to be able to be the person who decides what policies we have. So we have really attacked some of these things, and diversity is a big one from a policy perspective. In this specific example, we did Thanksgiving as gratitude, food, parades, and we had our display there is two-sided, and one part of the display is Indigenous authors, because November is also Indigenous Authors or Indigenous Peoples Month. So we cast the net really broadly. We did not do anything that was explicitly Thanksgiving. We talked about the concepts that are shared amongst most people about being grateful and being thankful and gathering with your family and perhaps eating a food. And we celebrated Indigenous authors and really shined a spotlight on their work because they're so underrepresented in publishing. From a policy perspective, this plays out in a few ways. This slide shows my workplace's Instagram feed. We are very active on Instagram, and we have a blanket policy. All posts and marketing in general have to contain at least 30% own voices and at least 40% diversity. So we tend to do things in threes because that's just what the marketing people tell me to do. So we'll recommend 3 books in a post. A picture will contain multiple items. At least one of those is an own voice. We do book recommendation Instagram stories where I'm like talking directly to the camera each week. And we put the diverse book first because that is going to be the slide that is most viewed of anything that comes after it. When we recommend books, people will come and say, hey, I have a grant. I need books. I can do books for second graders. When I come back with a list of recommendations, it's 40% diverse titles, and I have explicitly labeled them that way. When we recommend books to patrons or customers, and they say, hey, my kid loves books about dragons, we're going to recommend 3 books. At least one of them is going to be a author of color. And these are mandatory policies that we hold all of our staff to. It's included in training, and it's included in people's evaluations. I feel really strongly that one of the effective ways to begin to dismantle systematic racism is to change your policies in the systems themselves. If you require it of people instead of asking it of people, it changes the question.
Right. And if you're not the person who makes policies for everybody, you can at least start with making personal policies. So you can check your story time before you do it. You can check your own book display. You can do all of that. But if you just, I make myself new rules because I'm a little rule follower. So if I make myself rules and goals, I'm more likely to get it done. So we also do gratitude and thank you story time. And honestly, it works better with small children because teaching them anything about history is confusing. So, but they understand saying thank you. So Thanksgiving is very confusing for small children. It was actually very freeing to just let it go as a story time topic. Let it go. That's all right. It's not the only hard holiday, though.
While we're on the topic of holidays. Yikes. Holidays are problematic, but also beloved. So you're kind of in a pickle. A big chunk of your community may want holiday programming, and a holiday programming may be of interest to huge numbers of people in your community. So here's where Amy and I are on this. Go big or go home. And we really do mean go big. All the holidays, like all of them, so many holidays. Do all the holidays. This does not mean that you are going to just do Hanukkah and Kwanzaa because you do Christmas. I mean all year long. Chinese New Year, Diwali, Winter Solstice, Eid, Day of the Dead, and on and on and on. National Donut Day. Do them all. It can be hard because I know that's what comes up over and over again when we see that on Storytime Underground is people say, my director says I have to do the gingerbread program. And I'm like, I get it. The gingerbread program brought in 500 people. But the way to do it is say yes and.
Yes. Right. It is. And also, when you're doing your ands and you're doing holidays you're less familiar with, make sure that you get help to do it properly so that you don't accidentally do something very disrespectful without knowing that you've done it, and because you don't know enough about the holiday that you're celebrating. So we've had great success with Diwali because it's a super fun holiday, and I have a really generous parent who has taken the lead on telling what we should do, and I get her what she needs, and we work together and we get it done, and it's been very, very fun to do that. I recently did Chinese New Year, which is also, because I learned this, Jill, called Lunar New Year across Asia, but China likes to call it Chinese New Year because, and I had so much fun developing the program with the parents, and I had they were really excited to be involved in helping to lead story time, and their kids helped us with learning all these new Chinese words, and we had so much fun with this program, and it turned out so different than I thought it would when we first floated the idea, because I really let them tell me where to go with the program, because I didn't know enough about the holiday to make it approachable for ages 0 to 5, but still teach them something that they might want to learn about that holiday. So it was really fun. And I think the other big thing, I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, if you're doing a holiday program, label it as a holiday program. So I never make my weekly story times explicitly a holiday program, because those people are going to come to all the time, and I want them to always feel welcome. But if you're doing a holiday program, make sure that it's in the title so that people know what they're coming to and they're not blindsided by that. So, and have non-holiday options available during dominant holiday time. So like during December, it's nice to have some non-Christmas programs, because that just tends to take over, but maybe not everybody's celebrating Christmas in your community. Probably not, but they're not necessarily going to say a lot about it if you feel really squashed in that. So yeah, go big and go home, and also leave a holiday-free zone within your programming. And your book displays.
Oh, yes. Yes. So let's say you want to rethink some things. Like we've been talking to Lisa in the discussion box, and she said, I have a small library. Maybe I don't own a dragon book that's written by an author of color right now. Absolutely. Or you might say, I really want to do this, but I'm the only person who thinks this is important at my library. My boss isn't interested in it. Nobody's asking for it. Or I've got staff members who disagree with me and they don't want to do it. And I get that. Pushback sucks.
Yes, it does.
Yes. So Amy and I kind of talked briefly before this about like, how do we address pushback? And here's some ideas that we have come up with. Put ideas down in the discussion box, because pushback is hard. I want to hear what you do. Amy and I both felt that we say yes and. So yes, I'm going to do the gingerbread program. And I'm also going to do Lunar New Year. And I'm going to make all my story times that week not Christmas themed. And.
Wait. So, maybe some more work, but worthwhile, worth doing. And once you're sort of set up and you've got templates, it's a lot easier to go through it. Another way I like to respond to pushback, and I'm a big fan of practicing what I'm going to say. So like even before a little story time, I will practice how I'm going to introduce a book at my desk. My coworkers always laugh because I'm always talking to myself at my desk, practicing things. But I particularly practice if I have to, what I'm going to say when that mom who always gets out her phone. But so I have things that I say, like if someone objects to a book, I always say, I'm so glad that you're reading to your child and that you're involved in their reading. It really tells me what a great parent you are. And so that they know that I'm recognizing, hey, they did read this book, their kids reading, that's good. And then I have things, I say, we serve a wide variety in the community. There are lots of books available. I encourage you to choose another one if this isn't a book that you agree with, but I know that there are patrons who also need and love this book. And these are the words that I say. Like, I have practiced them, so I know exactly what to say. And then if they still want a challenge, I can direct them to the form. But having the words ready to go if you are expecting pushback on something is very helpful. So I encourage you to practice it. And then also, if you meet it with kindness, it always helps.
The example Amy and I were really talking about when we talked about having a canned response ready was drag queen story time. Like, that's not going to be for all members of my community. I know that going in. So before I put it on the public calendar, we will have formulated a calm and kind response. I will have my ducks in a row. I will make sure that my boss is aware of what's going on. I will have pushed out the verbiage that we are going to use to all the staff people so that you get the exact same kind, thoughtful answer from everybody. So that's some pushback you know is going to happen and you can be aware of it. I think another way to handle it is through compromise. Amy mentioned labeling holiday programs. So if you're in a position where you really can't just not do holiday programs, you can label them, and then you can differentiate your weekly programs from special programs. And then you can say things like, we celebrate all holidays. Is there a holiday that's important to you that we can add to our calendar? We're always looking for new ideas. What else do we wanted to mention here?
We're at the end.
I know we're almost out of time. Sometimes it means I have to hustle to make something happen. I have to find a partner. I have to write a grant. I have to ask our families for help. But I think it's worth it.
It is.
We have a ton of really great resources for these topics specific that we've talked today and lots of others. Please go down to the discussion box, the downloads box, and grab those. There is a list of small publishers. Lisa had asked earlier about beefing up diverse book selections. The answer is small publishers. The big houses are slowly coming around to it, but there are niche publishers who are not being reviewed in Kirkus and SLJ, who are putting out really high quality own voices books, and go direct to the source and buy small.
And they're small, they really respond to you. If you send them an email or you have a question, they are so responsive. It's really nice. I found even as I'm not the person in charge of purchasing, and they will still be like, I'd love to talk to you about it. They can't wait to tell me about it. I do want to encourage you, I put together the blog lists for you. Mind those blogs. That's like a sort of a starter list, but all of those blogs have links to other blogs. And when you're reading any blog, I think the place to start is on the About page. Get to know the contributors and the purpose of the blog. And don't forget to look at older posts. If you just start with the most recent, you're a little bit at sea, because a lot of these blogs have been around for a decade now. So the back matter within those blogs is very valuable. But evaluate a blog the same way you would any information source, where you check that it is being written, in fact, by experts. So it's helpful to do that. And
the other thing I want to mention really quickly is widening your circle. Amy and I talked a lot about Twitter as this example, and I know Twitter can be like a barren wasteland of hate and vitriol. Here's what I encourage you to do. You're going to curate your experience. On Twitter, I follow libraries, bookstores, publishers, authors, illustrators, librarians, and booksellers. So what I get is very niche. All of that other stuff is also happening on Twitter, but I'm going and I am setting up specific content only.
And you may need to set up a second account if you need a feed like that in your life. So I, on various platforms, have secondary accounts where I just follow various interests on that account. And then I know that's what I'm going to look at, and I don't have it all mixed together in a messy soup. And I know that we are out of time, and we just scratched the surface. We considered so many controversial topics and then realized we couldn't cover them in an hour.
Yes. Amy and I made a list of other topics we wanted to talk to you about, and then we realized we needed like 5 hours worth of webinar. All of these topics are addressed in the resource list in the downloads box. So if you have seen any of the kerfuffles on social media and you haven't been sure how to approach them in your life, there are some resources in the downloads box.
Yes.
But also, we are here. Anne has very generously allowed us to go a few minutes over. If you have questions, we are happy to talk about what we've done and how we've handled things.
Thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks for participating.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Jill and Amy. I will allow time for questions if Brian doesn't mind. You see, Brian and I have to sit here and monitor, and Brian has to then edit this afterwards. So,
sorry, Brian. We love you, Brian. Lisa asked about own voices. So most of the publishers included are Own Voices publishers, and that is so much a part of so many of the blogs. So the Native American in Children's Literature blog, and the Brown Bookshelf, and Reading While White, which is probably the most helpful one to me, Reading While White. It points me to so many good things. Those all include lots and lots about Own Voices.
Yes, all the blogs Amy mentioned are on the handout, which I think is just called Did You See That Post?
Yeah, and then blogs. Yeah.
The publishers are their own document. It's that 14 kilobyte file at the bottom of the downloads box. It's publishers that specialize in Own Voices. And I think that's a big part of it is we tend to buy from the review sources, and the review sources are reviewing books where the publisher can afford to send out review copies and has marketing and other things. The deck is stacked against the stuff coming from the small publishers. And so if we go out of our way to curate a relationship with them, we can grow our knowledge and our collections. As Amy mentioned earlier, I have found that the sales reps and the marketing teams at the small publishers on that list, if you go to them and say, I want to grow my collection diversity, and I notice like these 3 books in your catalog, but maybe your library has a policy that you have to review books before you can buy them. Sometimes they will send you the full book as a PDF. Sometimes they have a review but it's not from a major journal, but it's been reviewed on a blog, and sometimes that will help you with your policy. If you reach out to them and express an interest, they're so helpful.
Yeah. Also, I have been finding some of my very favorite new books have been from these small publishers. Some imports and other things. I mean, I've just been finding incredible stuff through these small publishers. That's been very exciting to me. Things that because I think the longer you do this, right, the books kind of start to be like, oh, this is like this book and this is like this book. And then you will find things that are just like completely new and so excited. And I love that about small publishers.
And if you discover a smaller publisher that you really like, you can, if you're, for example, having carts pushed to you from Ingram, you can say, hey, I really love Lee and Low. Can you push me their full catalog twice a year, everything they did front list? And Ingram can totally set up your profile to do that. Any other questions?
I just want to reiterate the comment that I made in my posting earlier there, that the generational differences are astounding. I just spent the week with a 38-year-old and a 10-year-old who were both in my family, and I'm over 60, and it was amazing to see the generational differences and how we thought about things. And I mean, I admit I'm a 60-year-old racist, sexist pig, and I know this, and I understand it. I try to work within that framework. And then you look at the 38-year-old who is a little bit better. Then you look at the 10-year-old where she doesn't see any of that stuff, and she's no longer having those issues. And it's really astounding.
It is amazing. I learn a
And
lot from my kids.
The 38-year-old lives in New York, and the 10-year-old lives in Boston in a very mixed race neighborhood and mixed culture neighborhood too. So it's really interesting to see the difference. Where you live has a big impact on how you look at things.
It does.
All right.
Yay!
Thank you, Jill
Thanks
and
everybody
Amy.
for coming and for sticking around.
I hope
Gold
that
stars.
nobody loses their job for even just listening to this program. If you
I
like
think
these
we
issues and the
managed
things,
to put a good. There were no fights.
Right.
Everyone came to it with kindness, which was so helpful.
and if anybody in your library perhaps needs this program, remember that there will be a recording. So you may want to tell other people about it because they are important issues to talk about and they're not being discussed that much. So thank you very much for doing this. We're glad you all attended, and we hope to see you again soon at another PCI webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody.